The locked study door had been hiding secrets for months. When she finally broke in, expecting to find love letters from another woman, she found something that made infidelity seem merciful. 36 files, 36 names, all missing women, all vanished along her husband's railroad routes, and his handwriting filled every page. The big question is, why? Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. The first time Margaret noticed the change in her husband's behavior, she dismissed it as stress from his work with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Vernon Dunbar had always been a methodical man, the kind who arranged his desk with geometric precision and kept ledgers that balanced to the penny. In their 7 years of marriage in Grafton, West Virginia, Margaret had learned to read his moods through these small rituals. When work troubled him, he reorganized his tools. When finances worried him, he reviewed their household accounts. But in the spring of 1899, something shifted in ways she couldn't categorize or understand. The locked study appeared first. Vernon installed the new door lock himself one Saturday morning while Margaret visited her sister in Fairmont. He offered no explanation beyond mentioning sensitive railroad documents that required security. The explanation seemed reasonable enough. As a freight supervisor for the railroad's northern West Virginia routes, Vernon managed manifests, payroll records, and shipping schedules for 3 counties. Margaret accepted his reasoning without question. The late nights followed. Vernon began returning from work well after dark, sometimes not until 10 or 11 in the evening. He claimed extended shifts, emergency freight routing, unexpected inspections. The railroad was expanding its operations through Taylor County, he explained, and supervisory staff bore the burden of increased oversight. Again, Margaret found no reason to doubt him. The coal boom had brought unprecedented rail traffic through their region. Everyone worked longer hours. But the nervous reactions proved harder to dismiss. Vernon startled at unexpected sounds, a man perpetually caught off guard. He checked the windows repeatedly, drawing curtains that had always remained open. He began asking Margaret about her daily activities with an intensity that felt less like interest and more like surveillance. Where had she gone? Whom had she spoken with? What had they discussed? The questions arrived casually, embedded in ordinary conversation, but Margaret felt their weight nonetheless. The study became Vernon's sanctuary. He spent entire evenings behind that locked door, emerging only for brief meals, eaten in distracted silence. When Margaret knocked to offer coffee or ask about household matters, he answered through the door without opening it. The room glowed with lamplight until midnight, sometimes later. She heard papers rustling, drawers opening and closing, the scratch of pen on paper for hours at a stretch. Margaret told herself these were signs of infidelity. The locked room held love letters. The late nights concealed meetings with another woman. The nervousness stemmed from guilt. This explanation brought its own pain, but at least it made sense. Affairs happened. Men strayed. It was comprehensible, almost ordinary in its awfulness. The discovery of the handkerchief shattered that comfortable assumption. Margaret found it while searching Vernon's desk for household money one afternoon in early November. He kept emergency funds in the bottom drawer, money she'd accessed dozens of times before. But this time, wedged behind the cash box, she felt something soft. She pulled out a woman's handkerchief, fine linen with delicate embroidery along the edges. The initials stitched in one corner read EL. Margaret stood in their bedroom holding this small square of fabric, trying to construct a narrative that made sense. Perhaps it belonged to Vernon's mother, though those weren't her initials. Maybe a colleague's wife had dropped it, and Vernon meant to return it, but the handkerchief had been hidden, deliberately placed where it wouldn't be casually discovered. She returned to the desk. Behind the cash box, her searching fingers found more items. A small cameo brooch, a hair ribbon, faded and frayed, a tarnished silver locket. Each piece clearly belonged to a woman, and none belonged to Margaret. The objects had an old quality, things that had been handled and worn and treasured before ending up in her husband's drawer. That evening, Vernon left for another late shift at the railroad yard. Margaret watched him go, his leather case tucked under one arm, his step quick and purposeful. She waited 30 minutes to ensure he wouldn't return for forgotten items. Then, she retrieved the brass key she'd found months earlier while cleaning, a spare she'd discovered in an old coat pocket, and saved without mentioning it to Vernon. Her hand trembled as she approached the study door. Beyond this threshold lay answers she both needed and feared. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease. The mechanism turned with a soft click that seemed thunderous in the quiet house. Margaret pushed the door open and stepped into her husband's secret world. The room smelled of old paper and lamp oil, but what stopped Margaret's breath wasn't the smell. Vernon's study bore no resemblance to the orderly workspace she'd imagined during those long months of speculation. The walls held wooden filing cabinets, 4 of them, each drawer labeled with years spanning from 1894 to 1899. A large map of Taylor County dominated one wall, marked with dozens of red pins clustered along railroad routes and remote roads. The desk surface lay buried beneath stacks of newspapers, each one folded to expose specific articles. This wasn't the refuge of an unfaithful husband. It was an archive. Margaret approached the nearest filing cabinet, her hand still shaking from the transgression of entering this forbidden space. The top drawer bore a label reading 1894 to 1895. She pulled it open. Inside, hanging files stretched from front to back, each tab marked with a woman's name and a date. She counted 12 folders in this drawer alone. She lifted out the first file. The tab read, Eliza Mercer, April 1894. Inside, she found newspaper clippings from the Grafton Sentinel, each article carefully trimmed and mounted on heavier paper for preservation. The first clipping, dated April 9, 1894, reported that Miss Eliza Mercer, age 23, had failed to arrive at her sister's home in Clarksburg after boarding a train in Fairmont. The second article, published 2 days later, noted that authorities believed Miss Mercer had likely changed her travel plans without informing family members. The third and final clipping, dated April 20th, stated the matter was considered resolved as the young woman had presumably continued to destinations unknown. But Vernon's file didn't end with newspaper accounts. Behind the clippings, Margaret found a hand-drawn map showing the rail route between Fairmont and Clarksburg, with a specific stretch of track marked in red ink. Notes in Vernon's precise handwriting filled the margins. Approximate location of reported sighting, 3 miles south of Thornton Station. Witness described woman matching EM's appearance waiting beside tracks, approximately 4:30 p.m. No subsequent sightings confirmed. Margaret's fingers trembled as she turned to the next page. A small envelope contained personal items, the handkerchief with the initials EL she'd found in Vernon's desk, a tortoiseshell hair comb with several dark strands still caught in its teeth, a ticket stub from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, dated April 9th, 1894. At the bottom of the file, Vernon had written a detailed physical description of Eliza Mercer, information far more specific than anything published in the newspapers. Height, approximate weight, color of her traveling dress, the style of her boots, the contents of her carpet bag as described by her sister. Margaret replaced the file with numb fingers and pulled out another. Sarah Kincaid, September 1894. The pattern repeated. Newspaper articles about a disappearance, a map with marked locations, personal effects, Vernon's meticulous notes. Sarah Kincaid had been traveling from Grafton to Parkersburg when she vanished between stations. Authorities had conducted a brief search, found nothing, and concluded she'd likely left the area voluntarily. The third file documented Catherine Pruitt's disappearance in January of 1895. The fourth covered Hannah Beckworth in March of the same year. Each file contained the same elements: press coverage, maps, personal belongings, Vernon's detailed observations. Each case had been dismissed by local authorities as voluntary departure or simple misfortune. Each woman had been young, traveling alone, and poor enough that their disappearances generated minimal official concern. Margaret pulled open the second drawer. 8 more files. The third drawer held 9. The fourth contained 7 files, dated from 1898 through the current year, 1899. In total, 36 women had disappeared along railroad routes in Taylor County over 5 years. 36 cases that authorities had never properly investigated, and Vernon had documented every single one. She returned to the desk where the stacks of newspapers waited. These weren't random collections. Vernon had marked specific articles, not just about disappearances, but about railroad operations, freight schedules, personnel changes. He'd documented which conductors worked which routes, which stations operated with minimal staff, which stretches of track ran through isolated territory. The level of detail suggested years of systematic observation. Margaret found Vernon's journal beneath, the newspapers, a leather-bound volume filled with his angular script. She opened to a random page dated June of 1897. The entry began with dry observations about freight car maintenance and shipping schedules. But 3 paragraphs in, the tone shifted. Vernon had written about walking the rail line south of Grafton, searching for what he called points of concern. He'd noted the distance between telegraph poles, the visibility from nearby roads, the depth of the ravines running parallel to the tracks. A loose page tucked into the journal made Margaret's stomach turn cold. It was a list, written in Vernon's hand, of what he termed commonalities among the disappeared. All were women traveling alone. All vanished on routes where Vernon held supervisory authority. All disappeared during hours when freight operations ran heaviest and passenger traffic ran lightest. All cases were dismissed by authorities within days of being reported. Margaret heard the front door open. "Downstairs," Vernon's voice called out, asking if she was awake. She'd been in the study for over an hour, so absorbed in the horrifying discovery that she'd lost track of time. He was home far earlier than usual. His footsteps crossed the parlor, heading toward the stairs. In seconds, he would notice the study door standing open, the light from inside spilling into the hallway. Margaret looked at the evidence surrounding her, the archive of 36 women who'd vanished into the West Virginia mountains, and understood with terrible clarity that Vernon's obsession with these disappearances wasn't the curiosity of a concerned citizen. It was the documentation of someone who needed to remember every detail of what he'd done. Margaret had 30 seconds to hide the evidence and close the study door before Vernon reached the top of the stairs. She shoved the journal back under the newspapers, her hands moving with desperate speed despite their shaking. The file drawer wouldn't close. Properly, she'd pulled it too far forward, examining the contents. She forced it shut with her hip, the metal mechanism grinding loud enough that Vernon surely heard. The study door's lock clicked just as his footsteps turned down the hallway. She pressed herself against the wall beside the doorframe, holding her breath as his shadow passed in the narrow gap beneath. Vernon paused. Margaret heard the floor creak as he shifted his weight. Her pulse hammered so hard, she felt certain he could hear it through the door. Then his footsteps continued to their bedroom, and she heard him moving about, muttering something about forgotten paperwork. 5 minutes later, Vernon left the house again. Margaret waited until his footsteps faded down the street before returning to the study. She had perhaps 2 hours before he'd return for the evening. This time, she knew exactly what she was looking for. She pulled all 36 files from the cabinets and arranged them chronologically on the floor, creating a timeline of disappearances from 1894 through the current year. With the cases laid out in sequence, patterns emerged that individual files had obscured. The first disappearance Vernon had documented occurred in April of 1894. Eliza Mercer vanishing between Fairmont and Clarksburg. But Vernon's earliest notes weren't about Eliza. In a separate notebook Margaret found tucked beneath the filing cabinet, Vernon had written extensively about the inadequacy of the official investigation. He'd visited the Thornton station where Eliza was last reported seen. He'd interviewed the station master, the telegraph operator, and 3 local residents who lived near the tracks. He'd documented their statements with the precision of a professional investigator, noting exact times, weather conditions, and conflicting details in their accounts. The sheriff's office had sent a single deputy to ask basic questions and filed the case as a voluntary departure within 72 hours. Vernon had spent 3 weeks gathering evidence. Margaret moved to the second case. Sarah Kincaid's disappearance in September of 1894 followed an identical pattern. Young woman traveling alone on a route Vernon supervised, vanished between stations during late afternoon hours. Minimal official investigation. But Vernon had mapped the entire rail line, interviewed freight workers and local farmers, and documented every structure visible from the tracks. His notes filled 12 pages of careful observations about sight lines, terrain features, and potential witness locations. By the third case, Catherine Pruitt, in January of 1895, Vernon's investigation methods had become systematic. He'd created a standard form for documenting disappearances: victim information, last confirmed location, witness statements, physical evidence, official response, and what he termed environmental factors. He'd photographed disappearance sites, though Margaret found only written descriptions of the images, not the photographs themselves. He'd collected soil samples, measured distances, and noted the position of the sun at the time of each disappearance. The thoroughness was staggering. Vernon had built case files that professional investigators would envy. He'd cross-referenced rail schedules with freight manifests, identifying which trains operated on which routes at specific times. He'd documented every employee who worked the relevant routes, noting their schedules, responsibilities, and potential access to information about passenger movements. More disturbing were the patterns Vernon had identified across multiple cases. Margaret found a comparative analysis dated December of 1896, 2.5 years into his documentation. Vernon had noted that disappearances clustered along 3 specific rail segments, all characterized by steep terrain, limited visibility from roads, and minimal settlements. He'd observed that victims consistently vanished during periods of heavy freight traffic, when passenger cars ran with reduced staff. He documented that in every case, the women had purchased tickets at small stations where transactions were recorded only in local ledgers, not transmitted to central offices. Vernon had essentially mapped the perfect conditions for someone to vanish without generating sustained official attention. His notes about law enforcement responses grew increasingly critical over time. In the early cases, he'd simply documented the brief investigations and quick closures. By 1897, his journal entries contained harsh assessments of sheriff's deputies who conducted cursory interviews and accepted the most convenient explanations. He'd written extensively about the economic pressures that discouraged thorough investigations of transient populations. Young women traveling alone were presumed to be fleeing family situations or pursuing unsuitable relationships. Their disappearances generated sympathy, but rarely sustained investigative effort. Vernon had documented institutional failure with the same meticulous care he applied to the disappearances themselves. He'd preserved newspaper articles showing how each case faded from public attention within days. He'd collected correspondence between families and authorities, letters begging for continued searches that went unanswered. He'd tracked how many resources the county dedicated to finding wealthy citizens' lost property compared to finding vanished working-class women. Margaret discovered another pattern in Vernon's travel records. He maintained a separate journal documenting his movements for railroad business, and she found it matched precisely with the timing of his private investigations. Every time a woman disappeared, Vernon had official reasons to visit the relevant rail segments. His freight supervisor position gave him legitimate access to remote stations, track sections, and detailed information about passenger movements. He could investigate these cases so thoroughly because he was already present in these locations. Or perhaps he was present in these locations for entirely different reasons, and the investigations served as convenient cover. The final file, dated September of 1899, just 2 months earlier, contained something the others lacked. Vernon had written a summary analysis titled Commonalities and Conclusions. Margaret read it with growing horror. He'd identified that all victims fit specific criteria: traveling alone, carrying modest luggage, purchasing tickets for routes he supervised, vanishing during hours when his freight trains operated nearby. Then came the sentence that confirmed Margaret's worst fears. In each case, the victim would have encountered freight operations at the precise location and time of disappearance. Standard safety protocols require freight supervisors to ensure passengers clearance from active work zones. Vernon hadn't just documented these women's disappearances. His job required him to be present at the exact locations where they vanished. The man responsible for their safety was the last person positioned to see them alive. The second journal sat at the bottom of the lowest filing cabinet drawer, hidden beneath official railroad reports that Margaret almost didn't examine. This volume bore no title or label. The leather binding was newer than the investigation journal, purchased sometime in 1896, based on a receipt tucked inside the front cover. Margaret opened it expecting more meticulous documentation of disappearances and official failures. What she found instead made her previous discoveries seem almost innocent by comparison. The entries began in March of 1896, 2 years after Vernon started documenting the disappearances. The first page contained no preamble or explanation, just a date and a single paragraph, written in Vernon's familiar script. He described encountering a young woman at Thornton Station who'd missed her intended connection due to a delayed freight train. The woman had been anxious about reaching Clarksburg before nightfall. Vernon wrote that he had offered to arrange alternative transportation as freight supervisors occasionally did for stranded passengers. The entry ended there. No follow-up, no resolution. Just the encounter described with unusual detail. The woman's nervousness, her concern about traveling after dark, her gratitude for his offer of assistance. Margaret cross-referenced the date with Vernon's investigation files. No disappearance had been reported that day. Perhaps nothing had happened. Perhaps this was simply a routine interaction Vernon recorded for reasons she couldn't fathom. But the second entry, dated 2 weeks later, followed the same pattern. A woman waiting at a remote station. An offer of help. Detailed observations about her circumstances, her possessions, her traveling companions, or lack thereof. Again, no reported disappearance matched the date. The third entry was different. Vernon had written about a conversation with a freight worker named Garrett Shipley, who'd mentioned noticing how many young women traveled the northern routes alone. According to Vernon's account, Shipley had observed that such travelers were vulnerable, often carrying their entire savings, sometimes fleeing bad situations, and unlikely to be urgently missed. The entry continued with Vernon's thoughts about how railroad operations provided unique access to information about passenger movements, schedules, and vulnerabilities. Margaret felt her hands go numb as she turned the page. The next entry, dated May of 1896, referenced Hannah Beckworth by name. Hannah had disappeared in March of 1895, one of Vernon's earliest documented cases. But this entry wasn't an investigation report. Vernon had written about recognizing the pattern too late and understanding the significance only after. The phrasing was oblique, almost coded, but the implication was unmistakable. Vernon hadn't started investigating disappearances out of civic concern. He'd started documenting them after recognizing that something systematic was occurring along routes he supervised. Subsequent entries grew more explicit. Vernon wrote about identifying what he called opportunities, based on passenger manifests and freight schedules. He described analyzing which station stops offered privacy, which time periods saw minimal witness presence, which sections of track ran through sufficiently isolated terrain. These weren't observations from past investigations. They were prospective assessments, planning documents. An entry from September of 1896 contained a list titled Necessary Conditions. Vernon had enumerated factors required for what he termed successful encounters. The list included subject traveling alone, with limited luggage, ticket purchased for intermediate destination without confirmed lodging, departure during freight operation hours, route section with minimal settlement density, weather conditions allowing extended outdoor activity. Margaret's legal mind, trained through years of reviewing her father's contracts and business documents, recognized this as operational planning. Vernon wasn't documenting crimes after they occurred. He was establishing criteria for selecting victims. The journal continued chronologically through 1897 and 1898. Entries became more frequent and more detailed. Vernon wrote about specific women he'd encountered, describing their circumstances with the same precision he applied to freight manifests. He noted which women carried valuable items, who seemed most isolated from family connections, who displayed the kind of vulnerability that made them suitable targets. He never wrote explicitly about violence or harm. The coast language remained abstract, clinical, but the implications were unavoidable. When Vernon wrote about a successful resolution or an encounter proceeding as anticipated, Margaret understood he was describing the disappearances of real women whose files sat in the cabinets above. One entry from March of 1898 revealed the full scope of what Vernon had created. He'd written about the advantages of his position as freight supervisor, how it provided legitimate reasons to be present at remote locations, how it gave him authority to direct other workers away from certain areas, how freight operations created noise and distraction that concealed other activities. He'd described the railroad's culture of minimal oversight, where supervisors operated with substantial autonomy along isolated routes. Vernon had systematically exploited every aspect of his employment to create opportunities for predatory behavior. His position required him to travel alone through remote areas, gave him authority over other workers, and provided him with detailed information about passenger movements. The very job that made him a respected member of Grafton society had given him the tools to become something monstrous. Margaret found references to Garrett Shipley throughout the later entries. The freight worker wasn't merely a casual acquaintance. Vernon described coordinating schedules with Shipley, arranging for certain freight movements to occur at specific times, ensuring particular route sections remained free of other railroad personnel. The phrasing suggested collaboration, not coincidence. The most disturbing entries appeared in the final pages, dated within the past 3 months. Vernon had written about maintaining documentation as insurance and ensuring accurate records protect all involved parties. He'd described the files not as investigation materials, but as leverage. Detailed accounts that implicated others alongside himself. The railroad company, local law enforcement, freight workers who'd cooperated with his activities, all had reasons to ensure these cases remained closed. Vernon's meticulous record-keeping wasn't compulsion or obsession. It was a deliberate insurance policy. He'd documented everything, including the complicity of others, knowing that if he were ever exposed, he could bring down an entire network of corruption with him. Margaret closed the journal and sat in the silence of Vernon's study, surrounded by evidence of crimes that spanned 5 years and claimed 36 lives. The man she'd married, the respectable railroad supervisor who balanced ledgers and attended church and maintained their household with methodical care, had used his position and authority to prey on vulnerable women traveling through West Virginia's isolated mountain railways. The locked door, the secret files, the nervous behavior. None of it had been about protecting an affair. Vernon had been protecting a carefully constructed system of predation and the evidence that documented it. And now Margaret held that evidence in her hands, knowing that what she did next would determine whether these women's disappearances remained officially unexplained or whether the truth would finally be acknowledged, regardless of the cost. Margaret didn't hear Vernon's footsteps on the stairs this time, because she'd been too absorbed in the horror of what she was reading. The study door opened. Vernon stood in the doorway, still wearing his railroad coat, his leather case in one hand. His eyes moved methodically across the scene. The files spread across the floor, the journals open on his desk. Margaret frozen in his chair with evidence literally in her hands. His expression didn't change. No shock, no anger, not even surprise. He simply observed the situation with the same analytical detachment he applied to freight manifests. "I forgot my route schedules," he said, setting his case down carefully. "I see you found the spare key." Margaret couldn't speak. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but Vernon stood between her and the door. Her mind raced through explanations, denials, anything that might diffuse the moment. But the files surrounding her made pretense impossible. Vernon closed the door behind him and locked it. The click of the mechanism echoed in the small room. He removed his coat, hung it on the hook with his usual precision, and sat in the chair opposite his desk. When he spoke again, His voice carried the same measured tone he used when discussing household expenses. "How much have you read?" Margaret found her voice, though it emerged barely above a whisper. "Enough." Vernon nodded, as if she'd confirmed a shipping detail. "Then we should discuss this properly. You have questions, I assume." The casual phrasing, the complete absence of defensiveness or fear, was more terrifying than if he'd threatened her outright. Margaret forced herself to meet his eyes. "The women. All of them. What did you do?" "What was necessary." Vernon leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. "Though I suspect you've already formed conclusions based on the documentation. My records are quite thorough. Vernon, this is 36 people. 36 women who disappeared. 36 documented in these files," he corrected. "I began keeping systematic records in 1894, but my work started considerably earlier, perhaps 15 years in total, though the earlier period was less organized. I've refined my methods substantially since then." Margaret felt the room tilt. He was discussing this like a business operation, describing refinements and improvements with the same attention to detail he brought to railroad logistics. "The first time was unplanned," Vernon continued, his tone almost conversational. "A woman traveling alone, stranded at a remote station. I offered assistance. The situation presented itself, and I recognized the opportunity. What struck me afterward wasn't guilt. It was how simple it had been. How completely she could vanish without generating sustained inquiry. That realization proved educational." He spoke about recognition and education as if describing a professional development experience. Margaret understood she was hearing something few people survived hearing. A predator explaining his evolution from opportunist to systematic operator. "My position with the railroad provided advantages I hadn't fully appreciated," Vernon said. "Freight supervisors travel constantly through isolated territory. We have legitimate reasons to be in remote locations at unusual hours. We direct other workers, control access to certain areas, manage schedules that affect who is present when and where. The infrastructure itself facilitates privacy." Margaret recognized this explanation. She'd read versions of it in his journal, but hearing Vernon articulate it aloud added a dimension of horror the written words had lacked. He was describing the exploitation of institutional trust and authority with the analytical precision of someone discussing supply chain efficiency. "The railroad culture proved equally advantageous," he continued. "Supervisors operate autonomously along their routes. Oversight is minimal. The company prioritizes freight movement and revenue generation over passenger services. Young women traveling alone, particularly those of modest means, represent negligible economic significance. Their disappearances don't disrupt operations or affect profitability. Therefore, they don't warrant extensive investigation." Vernon had identified systemic indifference as an exploitable resource. He'd recognized that certain populations could vanish without generating the institutional response that might expose him. The calculation was monstrous in its clarity. "And the law enforcement?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier now despite her terror. "The sheriff's deputies who closed these cases so quickly? Some were simply incompetent. Others were pragmatic. Taylor County has limited resources. Missing women who might have left voluntarily don't justify extensive manhunts. The deputies I worked with understood that certain investigations would prove fruitless and expensive." He paused. "Some also understood that railroad companies provide employment and tax revenue that counties depend upon. Maintaining positive relationships with railroad supervisors serves everyone's interests." Margaret heard the implication clearly. Vernon had cultivated relationships with law enforcement, not through explicit bribery, but through the subtler corruption of mutual benefit. Deputies who minimized investigations helped the railroad avoid negative attention. In return, the railroad remained a cooperative institutional partner. "Garrett Shipley," Margaret said. "The freight worker you mentioned repeatedly. He knew." Garrett understood operational necessities. He ensured certain freight movements occurred at specific times. He directed other workers away from particular locations when required. He never asked questions about why these arrangements mattered, and I never offered explanations. We had an efficient working relationship built on mutual discretion. Vernon described conspiracy in language stripped of moral content, reducing criminal collaboration to operational coordination. Margaret realized that what made Vernon truly dangerous wasn't rage or compulsion, but this complete absence of conscience. He'd approached predation as a professional skill to be refined through practice and systematic analysis. "The files," Margaret said. "Why document everything so thoroughly?" For the first time, Vernon's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been satisfaction crossing his features. "Insurance. If anyone ever attempted to expose my activities, these records demonstrate that I didn't act alone. Railroad officials who ignored patterns, deputies who closed cases without investigation, workers who facilitated necessary arrangements. The documentation implicates dozens of people across 3 counties. Revealing my actions requires revealing their complicity. That shared vulnerability ensures everyone's continued discretion." Margaret understood the full horror of what Vernon had constructed. He hadn't just committed crimes. He'd built a system that protected itself through mutual implication. Every person who'd failed to investigate, who'd looked away, who'd cooperated with suspicious requests, was now bound to silence by their own involvement. Vernon stood, walked to the filing cabinets, and ran his hand along their wooden surfaces. "You asked what I did to these women. I exploited institutional failures, geographic isolation, and systemic indifference to vulnerable populations. I recognized that certain people could disappear without generating consequences, and I acted on that recognition with methodical consistency for 15 years. He turned to face Margaret directly. "Now you understand. The question is what you intend to do with that understanding." Margaret's answer should have been simple, but Vernon's calm question hung in the air like a challenge he knew she couldn't meet. She wanted to scream that she'd go directly to the sheriff, that she'd expose everything, that justice would prevail. But even as these thoughts formed, she recognized them as fantasies. Vernon sat across from her with absolute confidence because he understood something Margaret was only beginning to comprehend. The law in 1899 West Virginia wasn't designed to protect women from men like him. It was designed to protect men like him from women like her. "I could report you," Margaret said, hearing the uncertainty in her own voice. Vernon nodded, as if she'd made a reasonable point in a business discussion. "You could. Let's consider what would happen. You'd approach Sheriff Dalton, who has closed every one of these cases himself. You'd present evidence obtained by unlawfully entering my private study. You'd make accusations against a respected railroad supervisor based on documents you'd need to explain how you accessed." He stood and retrieved a legal volume from his bookshelf, opening it to a marked page. "West Virginia law. A married woman has no legal standing to bring charges independently of her husband. Any testimony you provide would require my permission to be heard in court. Your legal identity is subsumed under mine. You have no separate existence before the law." Margaret knew this. She'd watched her father explain these same principles to female clients who sought legal recourse. But knowing it academically, and confronting its practical implications were different experiences entirely. The evidence itself presents problems, Vernon continued. These files document my private investigations into official failures. Nothing in them constitutes a confession. My journals contain analytical observations about railroad operations and theoretical vulnerabilities in passenger safety. Disturbing reading, perhaps, but not criminal admission. A skilled attorney, which the railroad would certainly provide, would argue I've been conducting a personal inquiry into systemic failures. Margaret thought of the journal entries she'd read, the careful phrasing that described everything without explicitly admitting anything. Vernon had written about opportunities and encounters and necessary arrangements, language that suggested but never definitively stated criminal action. He'd documented everything while simultaneously ensuring plausible deniability. Even if authorities took your accusations seriously, Vernon said, you'd face immediate challenges to your credibility. You're a wife making extraordinary claims about her husband based on documents you admit to stealing. Defense counsel would question your mental stability. They'd suggest marital discord, feminine hysteria, misinterpretation of innocent materials. The judge would be male. The jury would be male. The attorneys would be male. And they'd all wonder why a woman would betray her husband rather than address her concerns privately. He wasn't threatening her. He was educating her about the reality of her situation. Margaret felt the walls of that reality closing in with suffocating certainty. The families, Margaret said desperately. The families of the missing women would support the investigation. Perhaps, though most have already accepted official explanations. Their daughters left voluntarily, pursued unsuitable relationships, simply vanished into the uncertainties of modern life. Reopening these cases means confronting painful possibilities they've already processed and grieved. Some families would welcome renewed inquiry. Others would resist revisiting trauma for uncertain outcomes. Vernon returned to his chair, his posture relaxed. Consider also the political dimensions, Taylor. County's economy depends substantially on railroad operations. Mines ship coal via rail. Timber operations depend on rail transport. Businesses rely on rail connections. A scandal implicating railroad supervisors in systematic crimes would damage the company's reputation and potentially its operations. County officials who depend on railroad tax revenue and employment would have strong incentives to minimize such accusations. Margaret realized Vernon had thought through every angle, anticipated every potential response, and identified vulnerabilities in each approach. This wasn't improvised defense. He'd been preparing for possible exposure since he began documenting his crimes. And Garrett Shipley? Margaret asked. The other railroad employees? The deputies? They're all implicated in your files. They'd have reason to support an investigation. They'd have reasons to deny everything and destroy me for creating records of their involvement, which is precisely why those records exist. Mutual destruction ensures mutual silence. If I'm exposed, everyone connected to these cases faces consequences. That shared vulnerability protects all of us. Vernon had created a criminal ecosystem where everyone's safety depended on everyone else's silence. Breaking that silence meant triggering catastrophic exposure for dozens of people who had significant power and motivation to prevent it. There's another consideration, Vernon said, his tone shifting slightly. If you attempt to expose this and fail, which is the likely outcome given the factors I've described, you'll have made yourself a liability. The railroad has resources to address liabilities. Accidents happen. Women experience sudden health crises. Mental instability runs in families. These are unfortunate possibilities that become more likely when someone threatens powerful institutions. The threat was delicately phrased, but unmistakable. Margaret wasn't just fighting Vernon. She'd be fighting the railroad, company, cooperative law enforcement, complicit workers, and an entire legal system that denied her standing to act independently. "So I do nothing?" Margaret said, anger finally breaking through her fear. "I live with this knowledge? I remain married to you, knowing what you've done?" You continue your life with an unfortunate awareness of realities most people never confront. You accept that justice, particularly for poor women who travel alone, is a comforting fiction rather than a functional system. You recognize that institutions protect themselves and those useful to them, not vulnerable populations who lack economic or political influence. Vernon stood, indicating the conversation was concluded. "I'll be working late tomorrow. I suggest you use that time to consider your situation carefully. You're an intelligent woman, Margaret. You understand practical realities. Your education and family background have given you advantages many lack, but they haven't given you power to. Challenge what I've described." He moved toward the door, then paused. "One more thing. The documents remain here under lock. If they disappear, or if you attempt to create copies, I'll know. And certain arrangements I've established with colleagues would activate. Those arrangements concern your safety and your family's well-being. I trust you understand." Vernon unlocked the door and left Margaret alone in his study, surrounded by evidence of crimes she couldn't report, married to a monster she couldn't escape, trapped in a legal and social system designed to ensure her powerlessness. The files around her documented 36 lives ended because vulnerable women encountered a predator protected by institutional indifference. And now Margaret understood she might become the 37th, not because she'd be directly harmed, but because the system itself would ensure her voice was never heard. Margaret waited 3 days before making her first move, knowing that Vernon would be watching for immediate reaction. She maintained perfect normalcy during those 72 hours. She prepared meals at usual times, managed household accounts, attended church on Sunday, where she sat beside Vernon and sang hymns with appropriate devotion. She smiled at neighbors, discussed weather and local gossip, performed the role of respectable railroad supervisor's wife with practiced ease. But during the hours Vernon spent at work or locked in his study, Margaret conducted an investigation of her own. She began with Sarah Kincaid's family in Grafton. Vernon's files listed Sarah's sister as her closest relation, a woman named Ruth Kincaid, who worked as a seamstress on Main Street. Margaret invented a reason to require alterations and visited Ruth's shop on a Tuesday morning when she knew Vernon would be inspecting freight operations near Thornton. Ruth Kincaid was 43 years old, her hands permanently marked by needle pricks and thread stains. When Margaret carefully introduced the subject of missing women along railroad routes, Ruth's expression shifted from professional courtesy to something harder. "My sister didn't run off with some man like they said," Ruth told her, keeping her voice low despite the empty shop. "Sarah was traveling to a job position in Parkersburg. She had a letter of employment. She carried $19 in savings. The sheriff's deputy spent maybe an hour asking questions before deciding she'd changed her mind about the job." Margaret asked if Ruth had pursued the matter further. The seamstress's laugh held no humor. "I went to the sheriff's office 4 times. Each time they told me young women often changed plans impulsively. When I insisted Sarah wouldn't abandon her belongings and savings without word, they suggested maybe I didn't know my sister as well as I thought. By the 3rd visit, the deputy told me I was wasting county resources on a woman who'd clearly left voluntarily." Ruth had kept every document from her attempts to investigate Sarah's disappearance. Margaret examined letters the seamstress had written to state authorities, all of which received polite responses explaining that local jurisdictions handled missing person cases. Ruth had contacted newspapers, but only the Grafton Sentinel had published a brief notice. She'd hired a private inquiry agent who'd spent 2 weeks asking questions before informing her that without cooperation from railroad authorities, he couldn't access relevant information. The railroad wouldn't let him examine passenger records or interview employees, Ruth said. They claimed privacy concerns and company policy. When he pressed the issue, suddenly his other clients started receiving suggestions that hiring him might complicate their business relationships. He apologized and returned my deposit. Margaret recognized the pattern Vernon had described. The railroad protected itself and those useful to it, discouraging investigations that might generate negative attention. Over the next week, Margaret visited 6 more families. She traveled to Fairmont under the pretense of visiting her sister, stopping instead at the boarding house where Eliza Mercer's mother worked as a cook. She attended a church social in Thornton, where Catherine Pruitt's aunt still lived. She wrote letters to families in more distant locations, carefully phrasing her inquiries as research for an article about missing persons. The testimonies followed similar patterns. Young women traveling alone for employment or family visits, disappearances during trips that should have taken hours, not days. Minimal official investigation followed by quick closure. Families who persisted in seeking answers encountered bureaucratic obstacles and subtle pressure to accept the official conclusions. 2 families revealed information Vernon's files hadn't contained. Hannah Beckworth's brother told Margaret that he'd spoken with a railroad freight worker who'd seen Hannah at a remote station talking with a well-dressed man. The worker couldn't identify the man, but remembered he'd spoken with authority, like someone who belonged there. When Hannah's brother tried to locate this witness again, he learned the freight worker had transferred to Ohio operations suddenly, and the railroad declined to provide forwarding information. Catherine Pruitt's cousin described how Catherine had mentioned meeting a helpful railroad supervisor who'd promised to ensure her safe passage through a difficult route section. The cousin had thought nothing of it at the time. Supervisors occasionally provided such assurances to nervous travelers. But after Catherine vanished, this detail took on sinister significance. The cousin had mentioned it to investigators, who'd dismissed it as irrelevant. Margaret's most disturbing discovery came from a conversation with the widow of a railroad security agent. The woman, Mrs. Lavinia Hotchkiss, lived in a small house near the rail yards. Her husband had died 2 years earlier in what was officially recorded as a workplace accident. But Mrs. Hotchkiss clearly harbored suspicions about the circumstances. Walter became troubled in his final months, she told Margaret over tea. He'd worked security for the railroad 15 years without complaint. Then suddenly, he was drinking, having nightmares, talking about things that bothered his conscience. He wouldn't explain specifics, just said some supervisors took advantage of their positions in ways the company preferred not to examine. Margaret asked carefully if Walter had mentioned which supervisors or what activities concerned him. Mrs. Hotchkiss hesitated, clearly weighing whether to trust this stranger with dangerous information. He mentioned Vernon Dunbar once, said Dunbar was careful, methodical, and protected by people who valued that care. Walter also mentioned other security agents who'd helped with what he called cleanup operations, making sure certain situations didn't create problems for the company. He said they were compensated through quiet bonuses that never appeared in official records. The widow's hands shook as she poured more tea. 2 weeks after Walter told me he was considering reporting concerns to state authorities, there was an accident in the freight yard, a coupling failure that crushed him. The railroad ruled it equipment malfunction and paid me a widow's settlement that was significantly larger than standard death benefits. The payment came with documents I had to sign, agreements not to pursue additional inquiry into the circumstances. Margaret understood the implication. Walter Hotchkiss had been silenced permanently, and his widow had been bought into silence with a generous settlement that came with legal constraints. By the end of her second week of investigation, Margaret had compiled testimonies from 11 families whose loved ones appeared in Vernon's files. She'd identified patterns of railroad obstruction, witness intimidation, and strategic transfers of employees who'd seen too much. She'd documented how security agents had participated in covering evidence, a conspiracy that extended far beyond Vernon himself. Most importantly, she'd gathered this information without Vernon's knowledge. The families she'd contacted had no connection to Grafton society. They lived in different towns, worked in different circles, and had no reason to mention conversations with a railroad supervisor's wife. Margaret had been careful to leave no documentary trail, keeping her notes hidden in her sister's home in Fairmont, creating the evidence Vernon didn't know existed. Vernon had his files as insurance against the people he'd implicated. Now, Margaret had testimonies that corroborated those files, while establishing a record of institutional failure he couldn't control or destroy. She'd found the voices the system had silenced, and she'd preserved their stories. Margaret discovered the flaw in Vernon's insurance system while transcribing his journal entries in her sister's kitchen at 2 a.m. Vernon's files were designed to implicate others, ensuring that exposing him meant exposing everyone connected to the crimes. But his meticulous documentation also created the only comprehensive record of what had actually happened to 36 women. The very evidence he'd created to protect himself through mutual destruction could become the proof that demanded accountability, provided someone could access it without his knowledge. Margaret had been making copies for 3 weeks. Every time Vernon worked late or traveled for railroad inspections, she entered the study with increasing confidence. She'd discovered that Vernon's methodical nature made him predictable. He arranged his files in precise order. He marked his place in journals with specific bookmarks. He stored documents according to systematic organization that made detecting tampering easy, but also made replacing items in exact positions equally straightforward. She worked in 30-minute intervals, never touching more than 2 files per session. She memorized the exact angle of each folder, the specific position of each bookmark, even the way papers naturally settled in drawers. After transcribing information, she returned everything to its precise location before Vernon came home. The process required extraordinary care. Margaret couldn't simply remove documents. Vernon would notice missing items immediately. Instead, she copied everything by hand, sitting at the kitchen table in Fairmont, while her sister kept watch from the window. She transcribed Vernon's journals word for word, copied maps with careful attention to every marked location, listed the contents and descriptions of personal effects he'd collected. The work was exhausting. Vernon's handwriting was small and precise, requiring intense concentration to decipher. His journals alone contained hundreds of pages spanning 5 years. Margaret persisted, driven by the understanding that these copies represented the only evidence she might control. She focused on documenting 3 categories of information. First, Vernon's own admissions of his activities, particularly journal entries that described his methods and reasoning. Second, evidence of conspiracy involving railroad security agents, freight workers, and complicit officials. Third, detailed information about the victims themselves, the human lives reduced to files in Vernon's cabinets. This third category proved most emotionally difficult. Vernon had documented not just the circumstances of each disappearance, but personal details about the women themselves. Their hopes, their reasons for traveling, their families, their possessions. He'd preserved these human details with the same care he applied to documenting freight operations. Reading these descriptions while transcribing them forced Margaret to confront the reality that these weren't abstract victims, but specific people whose lives had been stolen. Sarah Kincaid had been traveling to a dressmaking position in Parkersburg, carrying a letter from her future employer and fabric samples she'd purchased with her savings. Eliza Mercer was visiting her sister before starting work as a teacher in Clarksburg, excited about her first formal employment. Catherine Pruitt had been joining her fiancé, who'd found work in the coal mines. Each woman had a story, a purpose, a future that Vernon had eliminated. Margaret transcribed these stories knowing they represented more than evidence. They were testimonies, final records of lives that official documents had erased through bureaucratic indifference. The transcription work gave Margaret unexpected insight into Vernon's psychology. His journals revealed a mind that approached predation as problem-solving. He'd identified systemic vulnerabilities and exploited them with methodical efficiency. He'd analyzed failure points in railroad safety protocols the way an engineer might analyze structural weaknesses. His documentation read like technical reports, stripped of emotion or moral consideration. But beneath this clinical approach, Margaret detected something else. Vernon wrote about his activities with a precision that exceeded practical necessity. He described details no insurance policy required, preserved items that served no protective purpose. The handkerchiefs, the hair ribbons, the small personal effects carefully stored in his desk weren't evidence or leverage. They were trophies. This realization changed Margaret's understanding of the files. Vernon claimed he documented everything for protection, and that was partly true. But he also documented everything because he wanted to remember. The files allowed him to revisit each case, to recall specific details, to preserve experiences that might otherwise fade from memory. His record-keeping served dual purposes: insurance and reminiscence. This obsessive preservation meant Vernon had created extraordinarily complete documentation. He hadn't just kept enough evidence to implicate co-conspirators. He'd kept everything, motivated partly by self-protection and partly by compulsion. That completeness made his files devastating as potential legal evidence. Margaret's copies grew into a substantial archive of their own. She stored them in a locked trunk in her sister's attic, organized with the same systematic care Vernon applied to his originals. She created an index, cross-referencing entries by victim name, date, location, and implicated parties. She compiled a summary document that outlined the scope of the crimes and the institutional failures that enabled them. By mid-November, Margaret had transcribed approximately 70% of Vernon's files. She focused on the most recent cases and the most explicit journal entries, prioritizing material that clearly established Vernon's involvement and the broader conspiracy. She worked with increasing urgency, aware that Vernon's behavior was changing in ways that suggested growing suspicion. He'd begun asking about her activities with greater frequency. Where had she been? Whom had she visited? What had they discussed? The questions arrived casually, but Margaret recognized the pattern from his journals. Vernon was gathering information, assessing potential threats, preparing for problems before they fully materialized. She'd also noticed him checking the study more frequently. He'd enter the room for brief periods, his eyes moving across the filing cabinets and desk, as if confirming everything remained undisturbed. Once, Margaret watched from the hallway as Vernon ran his finger along the spines of his journals, testing their exact position on the shelf. The night she completed transcribing his most damning journal entries, Margaret made a critical decision. She couldn't copy everything without eventually being discovered, but she could ensure the most important evidence existed in 2 locations. If Vernon destroyed his files, her copies would survive. If anything happened to her, someone who found the trunk would understand what the documents represented. She wrote a cover letter explaining the contents, addressed to a federal railroad inspector in Washington, whose name she'd found in railroad industry directories. The letter remained unsealed, ready to be completed with specific details if circumstances required. For now, it served as an explanation for anyone who might discover the trunk before Margaret could act on the information herself. Vernon's files had been designed to ensure silence through mutual implication, but Margaret had transformed them into something Vernon hadn't anticipated. Evidence that existed beyond his control, copied by someone with motivation to expose rather than protect him, preserved in a location he didn't know about and couldn't access. The predator's weapon was now pointed at the predator himself. Margaret knew Vernon had discovered her activities when she returned from Fairmont and found all the study file drawers standing open. He sat at his desk, perfectly still, his hands folded on the surface. The folders lay spread across the floor in the same arrangement Margaret had used when first examining them weeks earlier. On the desk before him sat 3 items. A hair ribbon Margaret had noticed in Sarah Kincaid's file, the same ribbon now positioned differently than it had been that morning, confirming someone had handled it recently. The ribbon was folded in thirds, Vernon said without looking up. You replaced it folded in half. A small error, but I notice small errors. Margaret's throat constricted. She'd been so careful with the major elements, the file positions, the journal bookmarks, the overall organization. But she'd missed one detail on an item she'd examined 3 weeks earlier. Vernon finally met her eyes. I've been tracking similar inconsistencies for 10 days. Documents, returned at slightly different angles. A journal page with a corner bent that was previously flat. Dust patterns disturbed on drawer surfaces. Individually, these might be coincidence. Collectively, they indicate systematic access. He stood, and Margaret saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not the clinical detachment he'd displayed during their first confrontation, but something more volatile. The methodical control was fracturing. Where are the copies? His voice remained level, but his hands trembled slightly. There are no copies. Margaret forced herself to maintain eye contact, though every instinct screamed at her to run. Vernon moved around the desk with sudden speed, closing the distance between them. Don't insult my intelligence. You've been visiting your sister with unusual frequency. You've been gone for hours at times, when household tasks don't require it. You've been accessing these files systematically, and you're intelligent enough to know you couldn't confront me without backup evidence. Margaret stepped backward. Vernon matched her movement, maintaining the distance between them at precisely arm's length. The families you contacted, he continued. Ruth Kincaid, Mrs. Hotchkiss, 6 others whose names I've now confirmed. You've been conducting an investigation of your own, gathering corroborating testimonies, building a case, all while playing the obedient wife at home. He'd known. For how long, Margaret couldn't determine, but Vernon had been tracking her activities while she'd thought herself undetected. The realization sent cold terror through her chest. The railroad employs people who monitor potential problems, Vernon said. When a supervisor's wife begins asking questions about missing women in multiple towns, that information reaches appropriate parties. I've known about your inquiries for 2 weeks. I've been waiting to see what you'd do with the information you gathered. Margaret reached the study doorway. Vernon didn't try to stop her, but his voice followed. You can't use what you've copied. The moment you approach authorities, the arrangements I mentioned before activate. Your sister's home in Fairmont, your parents' property. The people you love become leverage to ensure your silence. The explicit threat broke something in Margaret's restraint. You would harm my family. I would ensure everyone understands the cost of exposure. That's different from direct harm. But the distinction might not matter to people you care about. Vernon returned to his desk, but his movements had lost their usual precision. Papers scattered as he reached for his journal. You've created a problem that requires resolution, Margaret. I can't have you circulating evidence or testimonies. The system I've maintained depends on controlled information. Margaret saw clearly what Vernon couldn't quite articulate. She'd disrupted his sense of mastery, his belief in his own methodical control by conducting a secret investigation he'd only partially detected, by accessing his files without his knowledge. She'd introduced an element of uncertainty into his carefully organized world. And uncertainty made Vernon dangerous in new ways. I need to know where the copies are, Vernon said, his voice taking on an edge that hadn't been present before. I need to know who has them, what you plan to do with them, and how to neutralize the threat they represent. Margaret understood this was the moment. She could surrender the location of her transcripts, reveal her sister's involvement, and accept whatever containment Vernon would impose. Or she could run, knowing that leaving meant confirming everything Vernon suspected and triggering consequences she couldn't predict. She chose to run. Margaret turned and moved quickly down the stairs. Vernon's footsteps followed, faster than his usual measured pace. She grabbed her coat from the hall stand and reached the front door as Vernon descended the final steps. His hand caught her wrist, the grip tight enough to stop her momentum. You're not leaving. Margaret pulled against his grip. Let me go, Vernon. So you can do what? Run to your sister's home where I know you've hidden documents? Contact authorities who'll dismiss a hysterical wife's accusations? You have no viable path forward. Margaret twisted her wrist free with sudden force, surprising them both. She pulled the door open and stepped into the November cold. Vernon followed to the doorstep, but stopped there, unwilling to create a public scene on their residential street where neighbors might witness. If you leave, he called after her, if you attempt to use what you've copied, you'll force actions neither of us wants. You're making a mistake, Margaret. She didn't look back. Margaret walked quickly toward Main Street, her breath visible in the cold air, her hands shaking inside her coat pockets. She had maybe an hour before Vernon organized a response. She needed to reach the rail station, purchase a ticket to Wheeling, and disappear before he could mobilize the railroad resources he'd described. At the station, Margaret used the last of her personal funds to buy passage. The next train to Wheeling departed in 20 minutes. She waited in the ladies' sitting room, watching the platform through the window, terrified Vernon would appear before the train arrived. The locomotive pulled in precisely on schedule. Margaret boarded quickly, finding a seat in the rear car where she could observe the platform as the train departed. Vernon never appeared. But as the train pulled away from Grafton, Margaret saw 2 men in railroad worker clothing watching the departing cars with focused attention. Vernon was already mobilizing his resources. Margaret had perhaps 12 hours before he could organize a coordinated response. She had her sister's address in Fairmont, where the transcribed documents waited in a locked trunk. She had the names of families who shared their testimonies. And she had a federal inspector's name from railroad industry directories, someone outside West Virginia's local corruption networks who might actually listen to evidence Vernon couldn't suppress. The train carried her through the darkening West Virginia mountains, toward Wheeling, toward the confrontation she'd been avoiding since discovering Vernon's files. She'd chosen survival over silence, action over acceptance. Now she needed to find someone powerful enough to challenge the system Vernon had built and the institutional indifference that had protected him for 15 years. The Federal Railroad inspector Margaret contacted in December of 1899 listened to her testimony for 3 hours before speaking a single word. His name was Theodore Vaughn, and he'd spent 22 years investigating railroad safety violations, labor disputes, and operational failures across 7 states. Margaret met him in a Wheeling hotel lobby, carrying her sister's trunk of transcribed documents and testimonies from 11 families. She laid out the evidence methodically, presenting Vernon's journal entries, the files documenting 36 disappearances, and the patterns of institutional failure that had enabled them. Vaughn examined the materials with the same analytical precision Vernon had applied to creating them. He asked specific questions about dates, locations, and corroborating sources. He tested Margaret's credibility by inquiring about details she couldn't possibly know unless she'd actually accessed the original files. After 3 hours, he closed the final folder and met Margaret's eyes. "This evidence documents systematic criminal activity and institutional corruption spanning multiple counties," he said. "It also implicates a railroad company that employs thousands and generates millions in annual revenue. An investigation of this scope would require federal authority, cooperation from local officials who are themselves potentially implicated, and political will to challenge powerful economic interests." Margaret felt her hope crumbling. This was the pattern she'd feared. Another official explaining why justice was impractical. But Vaughn continued, "Which is why this investigation will proceed quietly, through internal railroad channels, without public disclosure that might trigger the mutual destruction your husband's files were designed to ensure. The railroad will resolve this problem in ways that protect its institutional interests while addressing the criminal activity you've documented." Margaret understood immediately what he was proposing. Not justice, but containment. Not exposure, but quiet elimination of the threat Vernon represented. 3 weeks later, Vernon Dunbar died in what was officially recorded as a freight yard accident, a coupling failure during routine operations. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad conducted an internal review, ruled the death accidental, and paid Margaret a substantial widow's settlement. The settlement came with documents she was required to sign, agreements that precluded future claims or inquiries into the circumstances of Vernon's death. Margaret signed the documents knowing exactly what they represented. Vernon had been eliminated by the same system that had protected him, removed as a liability when his activities threatened institutional interests. The railroad had arranged his death with the same efficiency Vernon had applied to his own crimes. The families of the disappeared women received no official notification. The cases remained closed, the victims still classified as voluntary departures or unexplained disappearances. Sheriff's deputies never reopened investigations. Newspapers never published revelations about systematic predation along railroad routes. Garrett Shipley and the implicated security agents continued their employment without consequence. But Margaret kept the transcribed files. She stored them carefully, adding documentation of her attempts to seek justice, preserving the testimonies families had shared. She spent the remaining 43 years of her life quietly advocating for missing women's cases, corresponding with families, pressuring local authorities to maintain better records, and conduct more thorough investigations. She never remarried. She used Vernon's death settlement to support herself and to fund small private inquiries into disappearances that authorities ignored. She wrote letters to legislators about the need for interstate cooperation in missing persons cases. She documented patterns of institutional failure with the same meticulous care Vernon had applied to documenting his crimes. Margaret died in 1942, having never achieved the public exposure she'd sought. Vernon's name remained respectable in Grafton. The railroad continued operations without acknowledging the systematic failures that had enabled his activities. The 36 women in his files remained officially unexplained disappearances, their families never receiving closure or acknowledgement. The truth emerged 68 years after the first disappearance, when a county clerk in Grafton discovered a sealed trunk in a courthouse basement during renovation work in 1967. The trunk contained Margaret's complete archive: Vernon's transcribed files, family testimonies, correspondence with authorities, and her own detailed documentation of institutional failures. A graduate student researching Appalachian Railroad history obtained access to the materials and published a comprehensive analysis in a regional history journal in 1972. The publication detailed Vernon's crimes, the conspiracy that protected him, and Margaret's decades-long effort to expose the truth. The article generated brief academic interest, but limited public attention. Most of the implicated parties were long dead, and the events seemed distant from modern concerns. Today, Vernon Dunbar's files and Margaret's advocacy work are preserved in the West Virginia State Archives. Researchers studying historical violence against women, railroad labor history, and institutional corruption occasionally reference the materials. The 36 women Vernon documented remain largely unknown beyond academic circles. Most have no photographs in the archive, just names, dates, and brief biographical details preserved by a predator and a woman who refused to let their disappearances remain hidden. Margaret Dunbar's story illustrates realities about historical justice that remain uncomfortable to acknowledge. Women who challenged powerful men often achieved containment rather than exposure, survival rather than vindication. Institutional interests prioritized self-protection over accountability. Evidence that should have generated criminal trials instead generated quiet settlements and sealed records. The files discovered in 1967 revealed not just Vernon's crimes, but the systematic failures that enabled them. They documented how geographic isolation, economic dependence, and gender inequality created conditions where certain people could vanish without sustained inquiry. They preserved testimonies from families who sought justice and encountered bureaucratic indifference. They proved that sometimes the evidence exists, meticulously documented and carefully preserved. But justice remains inaccessible because systems protect themselves more effectively than they protect vulnerable populations. Margaret Dunbar spent her life fighting institutional silence. Her victory wasn't the exposure she'd sought in 1899, but the preservation of truth that would eventually, decades later, be acknowledged by those willing to examine uncomfortable history. The women Vernon documented deserve more than academic footnotes. They deserve names spoken aloud, lives remembered beyond the files a predator kept, and a survivor preserved. They deserve recognition that their disappearances weren't mysteries, but crimes enabled by systematic failures that valued railroad profits over human lives. If this story disturbed you, that discomfort is appropriate. History isn't always heroic narratives and satisfying justice. Sometimes it's evidence discovered decades too late, advocacy that achieves preservation rather than vindication, and truths that remain uncomfortable long after the people involved have died. If you believe these stories matter, if you think historical failures should be acknowledged rather than forgotten, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel, because we don't shy away from the dark chapters that shaped our past. These women existed. Their stories deserve to be told. And Margaret Dunbar's refusal to remain silent, even when silence would have been easier and safer, deserves to be remembered.